The rain had barely cleared from the highway when my phone buzzed, and in that split second, the world I thought I understood tilted sharply out of place. The sky was still streaked with silver, the kind that makes everything look colder, harsher. And my hands tightened on the steering wheel as a familiar ache rose in my chest. If you've ever trusted the wrong person, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because what I discovered next still chills me. The realization hit me like a punch. I wasn't just being left out, I was being erased. And as the road stretched ahead in a blur of dark asphalt and broken expectations, I felt something inside me fracture in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I was halfway down the highway when everything in me went cold. The road stretched out in front of me, but all I could feel was the sting of realizing I had been left out on purpose. It hit me in a slow, crushing wave. This wasn't a small misunderstanding. This was deliberate. As I drove, the hum of the engine felt louder than usual, almost mocking, filling the space where excitement should have been. I kept replaying the signs I had brushed off, the little shifts in tone, the way certain plans were discussed as if I didn't exist. Suddenly, it all made sense, and that clarity hurt more than the confusion ever did. My hands tightened on the wheel as disbelief mixed with a familiar ache I had tried too long to ignore. It was the kind of hurt that doesn't flare up all at once. It seeps in, settling heavy in your chest until breathing feels like work. I remember thinking that betrayal never shows up politely. It ambushes you in a moment that should have been ordinary. And as that stretch of highway carried me forward, I realized this wasn't the beginning at all. The roots of this moment reached far back, into a history I had tried to hold together long after it started breaking. I used to tell myself that every marriage had its rough edges, and that mine was no different. When I look back now, I can see how quietly my sense of worth thinned out over the years, almost the way a favorite sweater wears down until one day you notice the fabric has gone sheer. In the beginning, I believed I had found a place to belong. I poured myself into building a home with Mark, convincing myself that the little moments of distance from his family were simply misunderstandings or personality quirks. They were polite enough, but there was always that feeling of being observed rather than welcomed, as if I were a guest who had overstayed without realizing it. I brushed it off because I wanted peace. I told myself the warmth would come with time. Instead, the gap widened. Family plans were quietly made without me, and I learned about them only afterward. I remember the sting of those discoveries, but I softened it with excuses, insisting he was just forgetful or overwhelmed. It was easier to hold on to hope than confront the truth that I was being treated as optional. The same pattern crept into our finances. Small things at first, receipts tucked away, decisions made without a word, a growing sense that I was supposed to accept whatever I was told. I convinced myself it wasn't intentional, that every couple had one partner who handled the numbers. But deep down, I felt the imbalance settling in, subtle but undeniable. I kept telling myself to be patient, to give him the benefit of the doubt, because admitting otherwise meant facing how lonely I had become in my own marriage. Still, I stayed. I stayed because I believed loyalty would eventually be returned, because I thought love meant holding on even when the rope burned. I didn't realize how much I had normalized the disregard until that moment on the highway forced me to see it clearly. And that clarity didn't come by accident. It was only the start of everything that would unravel next, beginning with the house I thought was given to us in trust. I remember pulling off the highway and sitting there for a moment, letting the hurt settle into something sharper. It was the first time in years I felt a clean kind of clarity, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. I looked at the house I had bought as a gift, thinking it would bring everyone closer, and suddenly I saw it for what it had become, a symbol of how easily my generosity was taken for granted. That realization lit a quiet fire in me. I drove straight to a small real estate office downtown. My legs felt steady as I walked in, steadier than my heart. But there was no turning back. For once, I wasn't asking myself whether my choices would upset anyone. I wasn't bracing for the cold shoulder or the dismissive sighs. I was choosing me, and the weight of that decision felt both terrifying and liberating. As the paperwork started, my phone vibrated again and again in my bag. Mark, his sister, his mother, each name flashing like an old alarm I no longer needed to answer. I let every call ring out. I let every message sit unread. With each unanswered vibration, a layer of fear peeled away. By the time I stepped back outside, the air felt different, almost thinner. I didn't know it yet, but listing that house was only the first thread I would pull. And once it unraveled, the truth buried underneath would change everything I thought I knew. I went back to the house that afternoon, needing silence more than anything. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the late light slipping across the surface as if trying to soften what I was about to uncover. I opened Mark's laptop because I needed answers, not excuses. And the moment I clicked into the first folder, something in my stomach tightened. What I found wasn't chaos or disorganization. It was order, deliberate, structured, secretive. There were pay stubs showing a salary far higher than what he had claimed for years. Bonuses recorded in neat, quarterly entries. A separate account I had never heard of, showing deposits that didn't match anything he had ever told me about his work. My breath caught when I realized these weren't new entries. They went back years, stretching over the time when he insisted we needed to cut back, when he shrugged off my questions with that practiced tone that made me feel foolish for even asking. I opened another folder and found property documents, rental income, ownership shares, managed assets. The family business wasn't barely staying afloat. It was thriving, expanding, building equity while I quietly blamed myself for every financial strain we faced. Each document was another blow, each number a reminder of how thoroughly I had been kept in the dark. I felt something shift inside me, a cold steadiness settling where confusion used to sit. This wasn't forgetfulness or oversight. This was intentional, years of it. And as the truth pieced itself together in front of me, I realized the betrayal on the highway was only the surface. There was a deeper world he never intended for me to see, one he guarded with polished lies and half-truths. By the time I closed the laptop, I knew I hadn't reached the end of anything. I had only touched the first thread, and once pulled, it was going to drag everything else into the light. I thought I had already seen the worst of it, but once I started digging deeper, the truth unfolded in layers I never imagined. I went back into the folders, opening documents that looked harmless at first. Then the patterns began to surface. Investment accounts tied to names I didn't recognize, insurance policies listing beneficiaries I had never heard of, and transactions that hinted at properties far beyond the rentals I had already uncovered. Each file felt like a doorway into a version of my life I had never been allowed to see. What stunned me most was the organization. None of this was accidental. These accounts were curated, protected, hidden behind passwords he never intended for me to find. I traced rental deposits, dividends, and payments that painted a picture of a man who had been thriving while convincing me we were barely staying afloat. My confusion slowly shifted into a cold, steady anger. This wasn't neglect, it was strategy. But the blow that nearly took the air out of me came from a folder I almost skipped, labeled with a date that meant nothing at first glance. Inside were reports, detailed, clinical, invasive. A private investigator had compiled them, and as I read, I realized the subject wasn't him. It was me. My inheritance, my family history, my assets, my vulnerabilities. He had hired someone to map out what I would bring into the marriage, long before he ever claimed to fall in love with me. That violation cut deeper than any financial lie. It told me everything I needed to know about his intentions from the beginning. And as the shock settled, something inside me hardened. I couldn't face this alone. I needed expertise, someone who could help me understand the scope of what had been done. By the time I closed the computer, I knew exactly what my next step had to be. I needed an attorney. Walking into that attorney's office felt like carrying the weight of my entire marriage in my chest. I remember the quiet hum of the lobby and how my hands trembled just enough to remind me I was still shaken. For the first time since everything started unraveling, I admitted to myself that I couldn't sort through this alone. I needed someone who could look at the truth without flinching, someone who wasn't tangled in the web I had lived in for years. When I sat down across from her, the calm in her presence steadied me. She listened, really listened, as I laid out the pieces I had uncovered. I watched her expression shift in a way that told me my instincts had been right all along. The financial discrepancies, the hidden accounts, even the investigators' reports, they weren't coincidences. They were calculated choices. Hearing that acknowledgement, even silently, lifted something heavy off my shoulders. As she explained what my rights were and how the law viewed situations like mine, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the years I had spent doubting myself, and relief that I finally understood the leverage I had never realized was mine. She outlined options, protections, pathways forward, and with each one, my fear loosened its grip. By the time I left her office, I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was preparing. I knew the confrontation with his family was coming, and for once, I wouldn't be the one cornered. Walking into that house felt nothing like the dozens of times I had walked in before. The air was tight, charged, almost expectant, as if the walls themselves knew something was coming. I could hear the uneasy shifting of bodies in the living room before I even stepped fully inside. But unlike every other time, I didn't shrink. I didn't brace myself for their reactions or rehearse ways to keep the peace. I felt grounded, steady, almost unnervingly calm, as if the truth itself had taken my hand and walked me in. They were already gathered. Mark, his mother, his sister, each wearing a mix of irritation and forced concern. I could sense they expected explanations, apologies, maybe even a breakdown. What they didn't expect was silence. My silence. The kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're holding. I took my seat and felt a strange clarity settle over me. I laid the folders on the table, one by one, watching their eyes dart to the stack like it was a ticking clock. Inside were the financial records, the hidden accounts, the rental properties, the investment trails, and finally, the private investigators' reports. I didn't need to raise my voice or dramatize anything. I simply explained what I had uncovered, each revelation landing heavier than the last. Their faces shifted in real time, confusion to discomfort, discomfort to panic, while I stayed still, listening to my own heartbeat slow into something steady. For years, they had spoken to me like I was naive, overly emotional, easy to dismiss. But now, the room belonged to me. I could feel the balance of power tilting, not with aggression, but with certainty. I explained what I expected moving forward, what boundaries would no longer be crossed, and what protections were already being put in place. For the first time, they didn't interrupt. They didn't mock. They didn't dismiss. They just listened, unsure and unsteady, realizing I wasn't the woman they'd been managing and manipulating for years. As I gathered the folders, I noticed something flicker across Mark's face. Fear. Not of losing me, but of what else I might know. And that was when it struck me. Everything I had uncovered so far was only a fraction of the truth. There was a deeper layer waiting beneath all of this, something far bigger than hidden assets, something federal. I thought the confrontation would be the peak of everything, but later that night, sitting alone with the folders spread across my dining table, I realized I was only standing at the edge. I started reviewing the documents again, this time not as a betrayed wife, but as someone trying to understand a puzzle that kept widening. Certain forms caught my eye: applications, certifications, federal loan numbers I recognized from the news during the pandemic. At first, I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but the numbers lined up too perfectly, the discrepancies too bold to ignore. Deposits that matched forgiven loans, payroll claims that didn't reflect the actual size of the business, expenses that existed only on paper. As the pattern emerged, a cold, sinking feeling spread through me. This wasn't creative accounting or a family cutting corners. This was federal loan fraud, carried out with confidence and buried beneath layers of deception I had only begun to peel back. My heart pounded as I realized the gravity of what I was holding. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't even about the marriage. This was criminal, and I was staring straight at the evidence. Just as that thought settled, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, the tone of the voicemail urgent. Federal agents wanted to speak with me. Meeting the federal agents felt like stepping into a different reality. The room was plain, quiet, almost sterile, yet the weight inside it pressed against my ribs. I sat across from them with my hands folded, trying to steady my breathing, trying not to imagine all the ways this could turn my life upside down. When they opened their folders, I felt the air shift. These weren't the scattered documents I had pieced together alone. These were full investigations, timelines, financial trails, correspondences, filings. And then I saw my own name. I felt my stomach drop as they showed me forms that listed me as an officer in the company, certifications bearing a signature that wasn't mine, and filings that placed me squarely in the middle of federal loan transactions I had never heard of. Seeing it in black and white was like watching a slow-motion collapse of everything I thought I understood. Fear rushed through me, sharp and cold, but beneath it was something else: recognition. I had been used, deliberately and repeatedly, as the agents explained the scale of the fraud, the penalties, the years it had been happening. I felt the last threads of loyalty snap inside me. When they spoke about immunity, how cooperation would protect me because they knew I hadn't been involved, I felt something settle, a heavy, resolute calm. I wasn't just walking away from a marriage anymore. I was severing myself from a system built on lies that had swallowed me without my consent. By the end of the meeting, I knew exactly what needed to happen. I agreed to cooperate fully, knowing the next steps would shake everything apart, and not long after, the arrests began. The morning of the arrests felt strangely quiet, as if the world itself were holding its breath. I stood at a distance while federal agents moved with calm precision, their voices low, their presence unshakable. Watching Mark and his family step outside, surrounded by the people who had come to hold them accountable, felt unreal at first. These were the same faces that once dictated the rhythm of my days, the same voices that made me question my own judgment. Now they looked smaller, deflated, stripped of the authority they had wielded so carelessly. Shock washed through me, but it didn't last long. What followed was a slow, steady release, like an old knot finally loosening after years of tension. I wasn't proud of what had happened, but I wasn't mourning it either. Justice has a way of landing heavily, even when it lands exactly where it should. As the cars pulled away, I felt an unexpected stillness settle inside me. There was sadness, of course, the kind that comes from acknowledging that a whole chapter of your life has ended, but beneath it was something steadier, something almost hopeful. I turned away from the scene knowing that whatever came next would be mine to build, untouched by their control. And that was the first step toward becoming someone new. In the weeks after everything settled, my life felt strangely quiet, like the air after a long storm. For the first time in years, I woke up without bracing myself for someone else's expectations. I began rebuilding slowly, opening a small consulting business, taking on projects that challenged me, shaping routines that felt like my own. Each decision, even the small ones, reminded me that I wasn't living in someone else's shadow anymore. There was a softness to those early mornings, a steady confidence growing underneath the uncertainty. I learned how to trust myself again, how to enjoy the calm of my own company, how to build a life rooted in dignity instead of fear. The more I moved forward, the more I realized the strength I had carried all along. And as my new life began to take shape, I found myself reflecting on everything I had come through, ready to speak to the heart of it all. When I look back on everything I walked through, I see a version of myself I hardly recognize anymore. I remember the fear, the confusion, the constant second guessing, and I can feel how far I have moved from that place. What once felt like the end of my world became the beginning of a life built on honesty, strength, and a deeper sense of self-worth than I ever allowed myself before. I learned that peace is not something someone else gives you. It is something you reclaim when you finally choose yourself. Standing here now, I feel a quiet gratitude for the clarity that rose from all that chaos. I found my voice, my independence, and a future that is truly mine. And if my story reaches you in a moment when you feel small or unseen, I hope it reminds you that you deserve respect, truth, and a life that reflects your own worth. I would love to hear your thoughts, your experiences, or even the lessons you have carried through difficult seasons. Share them in the comments so we can learn from each other and lift one another up. Thank you for listening and for being here.